Oh boy, what does it mean? Boy, I don't even think about that kind of stuff.
For decades, Alison Krauss has been defined by control. Control of her voice, clear and almost weightless. Control of her violin, precise and effortless. Control of a career that turned a child prodigy into one of the most decorated artists in Grammy history, with 27 wins and counting. She carried bluegrass into the mainstream, built a legacy with Alison Krauss and Union Station, crossed genres with Raising Sand, and earned her place in both the Grand Ole Opry and the Bluegrass Hall of Fame. On paper, it's a near-perfect story, but away from the stage, there was one part of her life that never quite found its footing. In 2001, Krauss's marriage quietly came to an end. At the time, the reason seemed simple, even predictable. Touring schedules, distance, two lives moving in different directions. For years, that version of events stuck. Fans thought they understood what happened, and Krauss let the story sit exactly where it was, unfinished but unchallenged, until now. At 54, Krauss has finally spoken, and what she revealed pulls the curtain back on a truth far more complicated than anyone imagined. So, why is she choosing to tell the full story now? And what really caused the marriage to fall apart after everyone thought they already knew the answer? Join us as we get into all the shocking details. Alison Krauss's humble beginnings. Alison Maria Krauss was born in Decatur, Illinois, into a household that blended discipline, creativity, and curiosity. Her father, Fred Krauss, had arrived in the United States from Germany in 1952 at just 12 years old, carrying his language with him long before he earned a doctorate in psychology. He taught German while studying, then later pivoted into real estate, eventually owning a handful of notable properties, including the so-called American Football House in Urbana, a modest building that would later become an unlikely piece of pop culture history when it appeared on the cover of American football's debut album. Her mother, Louise Krauss, came from German and Italian roots and was the daughter of artists herself. She worked as an illustrator, lending her eye and hand to magazines and textbooks, and she carried that same creative instinct into her home. Fred and Louise met while studying at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and from the beginning, learning and art were treated as natural parts of daily life. After a short stay in Decatur following Alison's birth, the family settled in Champaign, where she grew up alongside her older brother, Victor. Music was never announced as a destiny in that house, but it was always present. Louise played banjo and acoustic guitar, which meant folk music lived in the background, unforced and familiar. At the same time, the radio filled the room with whatever the era offered, and young Alison absorbed it all. She gravitated toward Gary Numan's Cars, leaned into the slick edges of bands like Foreigner and Bad Company, and took in the sweeping sound of Electric Light Orchestra without worrying about genres or labels. Victor, meanwhile, was carving his own path, playing piano and double bass in high school and setting the stage for a future as a jazz and rock multi-instrumentalist. At 5 years old, Alison was nudged toward classical violin, not out of pressure, but out of possibility. Her mother believed in keeping doors open and wanted her involved in music, alongside art and sports. Alison didn't fall in love with practice right away. She resisted it, dragged her feet through lessons, and yet she stayed with classical training until she was 11, absorbing technique even when enthusiasm lagged behind. Outside of music, she poured just as much energy into roller skating, and for a time, it wasn't obvious which direction her life would tilt. In her early teens, she finally made a decision that music, not roller derby, would be the road she followed. That turning point sharpened in mid-1979, when Louise spotted a notice for a fiddle competition at the Champaign County Fair. Rather than overthink it, she bought a bluegrass fiddle instruction book and Richard Green's 1977 album, Duets. Alison didn't approach it academically. She learned by ear, lifting melodies directly from the record, including Tennessee Waltz, practicing on violin while her mother accompanied her on guitar. At just 8 years old, she entered the talent contest in the novice category and placed fourth. It wasn't a win, but it was enough to open something up. It was also where she first crossed paths with Andrea Zahn, who won the junior division that same year, an early intersection of futures that would later feel anything but accidental. From there, Alison leaned deeper into bluegrass, not because she was told to, but because it made sense to her. She discovered she had an unusual ability to hear complex riffs once and immediately reshape them into something personal. The genre didn't confine her, it gave her room. By 1981 and 1982, she was already performing with Marvin Lee Flessner's country dance band, fiddling and singing with a confidence that belied her age. In September 1983, her parents marked another milestone by buying her a custom violin made by hand in Missouri, her first full-sized instrument, a subtle acknowledgement that this wasn't just a phase anymore. At 13, the momentum became impossible to ignore. She won the Walnut Valley Festival Fiddle Championship, and the Society for the Preservation of Bluegrass in America named her the most promising fiddler in the Midwest. Vanity Fair would later describe her with a word usually reserved for artists twice her age: virtuoso. Around that same period, she met Dan Tyminski at a festival hosted by the Society, one of many encounters that would quietly shape her future. In fact, every current member of Union Station first crossed her path at those festivals, long before anyone could have predicted what that constellation of talent would become. Nothing about Alison Krauss's rise was loud. It unfolded in small towns, fairgrounds, practice rooms, and chance meetings, stitched together by instinct rather than ambition. Long before the Grammys, the legacy, or the careful control the world would later associate with her name, the foundation was already there, steady and unmistakable, waiting for the rest of the story to catch up. How Alison Krauss took over music. By the mid-1980s, Alison Krauss was no longer just the prodigy people whispered about at festivals. In 1986, at an age when most kids were still figuring themselves out, she made her recording debut on an independent album, collaborating with Swamp Weiss and Jim Hoyles, with her brother Victor right there beside her. Around the same time, she was performing regularly with bassist and songwriter John Pennell in a band first called Silver Rail. When the name had to be dropped, it became Union Station. It was a small change that would end up carrying enormous weight. That same year, she signed with Rounder Records, a move that gave her structure without squeezing the life out of her instincts. By 1987, just 16 years old, she released her debut album with Union Station backing her. Her voice already carrying that unmistakable stillness, the kind that makes people lean in rather than sing along. It didn't feel like a debut chasing attention. It felt like an arrival that didn't need to announce itself. What followed wasn't a rush to reinvent, but a steady widening of ground. A solo release led naturally into a full Union Station project, and then another. The rhythm of her career settled into something deliberate, alternating between solo work and the band, allowing her to explore intimacy on her own terms and then return to the collective sound that grounded her. When her first major solo breakthrough arrived in 1990, it didn't come with noise or spectacle. It came with quiet validation, chart recognition, her first Grammy, a sense that the wider industry had finally caught up to what bluegrass circles already knew. By the early 1990s, the momentum was undeniable. A second Union Station album earned her another Grammy, and in 1993, at just 21, she stepped onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry as its youngest member at the time. It wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a signal moment for bluegrass itself, which hadn't seen one of its own welcomed into that circle in nearly 3 decades. Krauss didn't arrive waving a flag. She simply stood there, calm and composed, and let the music do what it always did. Collaboration became a quiet through line in her career rather than a side note. She worked with traditional bluegrass families, lent her voice to country acts, and stepped easily into unexpected spaces without ever sounding out of place. When Dan Tyminski joined Union Station in the mid-1990s, the chemistry locked in. His voice and hers didn't compete. They held each other up. Around the same time, Krauss found herself crossing into the country mainstream, earning chart success and Grammy recognition without losing the emotional restraint that defined her work. By the mid-1990s, a compilation album brought her music to a much wider audience, not by chasing trends, but by reframing what she had already done. It sold in numbers that surprised even her, earned multiple industry awards, and proved that her voice could live comfortably outside strict genre lines without losing its center. The success didn't change her pace. If anything, it seemed to make her more careful. That restraint carried into the late 1990s when another Union Station release challenged expectations of what bluegrass was supposed to sound like. Critics noticed. New listeners followed. Her music slipped into popular television culture, quietly introducing her work to audiences who weren't looking for it but stayed once they heard it. A solo album followed soon after, one that leaned closer to adult contemporary without abandoning the emotional honesty that anchored everything she did. Even as her own albums stacked up, Krauss never stopped stepping into other people's projects. She sang harmony, played fiddle, and lent her voice across genres and continents, from American roots to Irish traditional music. She never treated collaboration as a detour. It was simply another way of listening. Then came the moment that pushed her sound into living rooms everywhere. In 2000, she contributed to the soundtrack of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, working closely with Dan Tyminski on a collection of songs that felt old and new at the same time. The album didn't just succeed, it exploded. It sold millions, won Album of the Year at the Grammys, and was widely credited with reigniting mainstream interest in bluegrass. Krauss, characteristically, pushed back on the narrative. She believed the audience had always been there. The film, in her view, simply removed the barrier. Behind all of it remained the same core. That clear soprano voice, often described as angelic but never showy. A deep respect for the musicians who shaped her, from bluegrass legends to country traditionalists. Songs that leaned toward sadness, not for drama, but because that's where honesty lived. Krauss rarely wrote her own material, not out of distance, but out of devotion to choosing the right song and building an album around its emotional gravity. By the turn of the millennium, Alison Krauss wasn't chasing relevance or redefining herself for attention. She had already built something steadier than that. A career shaped by listening, patience, and an almost stubborn refusal to oversell what was already powerful. The awards kept coming. The genres blurred. The voice stayed the same. And through it all, control remained her signature. But in 2015, all of that nearly came to an end. When Alison Krauss lost her voice, the silent battle that nearly ended everything. For most people, Alison Krauss is defined by her voice. Soft, high, almost weightless, the kind of sound that feels like it floats instead of pushes. That voice carried her through decades of music, earned her 27 Grammy Awards in just over 25 years, and set her apart as one of the most decorated singers in American history. It always seemed effortless, always there, which is why it came as such a shock when it wasn't. When Windy City arrived, it marked something unusual. It was her first solo album since the last millennium, and her first release of any kind in years. The gap wasn't about inspiration drying up or interest fading. It was far more unsettling than that. In the years leading up to the album, Krauss had been struggling with her voice itself. The diagnosis had a clinical name, dysphonia, but the experience was anything but neat. Her throat would tighten without warning. Singing felt like trying to force sound through a narrow straw. The harder she tried, the worse it became. Physical therapy offered no relief. Instead, the problem followed her onto stages, into studios, and eventually into moments she couldn't escape. In 2015, during a live show in Utah, it happened in real time. She stepped up to sing the opening verse, opened her mouth, and nothing came out. No warning, no second chance, just silence. The kind that makes your stomach drop, the kind that feels public and personal all at once. Someone else had to step in, and she stood there knowing exactly how exposed she was. It wasn't the first health battle she'd faced. She'd dealt with debilitating migraines for years, but this felt different. This struck at the very thing that defined her. And eventually, she reached a difficult conclusion. The problem wasn't only physical, it was mental too. She began to see it as a form of singer's block. Not the absence of skill, but the absence of clarity. She couldn't get herself into the emotional space where a performance felt honest. Every attempt felt forced, contrived, and when she listened back, she couldn't stand what she heard. That disconnect made everything tighten even more, feeding the cycle she couldn't break. During the long, frustrating recording process for Windy City, which had started years earlier, she finally sought out a vocal coach. It didn't take long for him to pinpoint the issue. She was overloaded, distracted, carrying too much mental weight into the booth. That tension was showing up as false emotion, and the body was reacting accordingly. A mental block turning physical. That realization didn't magically fix everything, but it shifted the way she understood her voice. For Krauss, singing had never been about control in the traditional sense. It was about presence, about being fully inside the story of a song. When that connection was there, the images came naturally. The performance unfolded on its own. When it wasn't, no amount of effort could fake it. The more she tried to force it, the further away it slipped. Learning to trust her voice again meant finding a way to get out of her own head. And sometimes that meant doing something completely unexpected. Before one show, when she felt her throat starting to close, panic crept in. With only minutes to spare, she reached out for help and was given an odd instruction: get angry. Not pretend anger, real anger. Say no, like you mean it. Open everything up. So she stepped outside and did exactly that. She found a tree, pointed at it, and started yelling, over and over. It felt ridiculous. Her band stared like she'd lost her mind. But she kept going. And when she walked back inside, something had shifted. The show went on. The voice held. The explanation was simple. People don't struggle to talk. They struggle to sing. Anger lives in a place of strength, not restraint. It opens the body instead of tightening it. Now, before performances, she still goes out and yells, sometimes at trees, sometimes into the open air. It works. She laughs about it now, imagining how useful it would have been to carry around a tiny bonsai to shout at whenever things got tight. The image amuses her. The solution still surprises her. But underneath the humor is something real. When Alison Krauss fell silent and someone else lived inside her name. For Alison Krauss, 2013 was already a fragile year. Her voice, the thing that had always answered when she called on it, was slipping away. Shows were fewer. Recording had slowed to a crawl. Silence was beginning to surround her, not as a choice, but as a necessity. And in that silence, something unsettling unfolded far from any stage. That year, a woman was arrested after arriving at a courthouse for what appeared to be an ordinary court appearance. It wasn't. For months, she had been living inside someone else's identity, convincing an elderly man that she was Alison Krauss herself. Not an impersonator, not a look-alike, the real thing. The story worked because it leaned on absence. Krauss hadn't been seen. She hadn't been heard. The gap made the lie easier to sell. By the time authorities intervened, the damage was devastating. The man's savings had nearly vanished. A house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had been signed over. Legal documents had been altered. Trust had been dismantled, piece by piece. The woman disappeared when ordered to undergo a mental evaluation, skipped court dates, forfeited bond, and briefly vanished before reappearing and being taken into custody. What followed was a slow legal reckoning that ended with a guilty plea, restitution, probation, and the return of what could still be salvaged. On paper, it was a case about deception, but beneath that, it exposed something quieter and more disturbing. Alison Krauss's voice had been gone long enough for someone else to step into the outline of her life and claim it. The illusion depended on silence, and silence was exactly what Krauss was living with at the time. While her name was being misused, the real Krauss was struggling just to make sound. She was learning that her voice didn't disappear all at once. It tightened, it resisted, it failed her in moments when it had never failed before. The retreat from music wasn't mysterious to her. It was survival. Singing no longer felt honest. Performing felt forced, and forcing it only made things worse. So as one woman used the image of Alison Krauss to take, the real Alison Krauss stepped back entirely, unwilling to pretend. She wasn't hiding. She was protecting what little connection she still had to her voice, waiting until it returned in a way that felt real again. The legal case eventually closed. The impersonation ended. The stolen name was returned to its rightful owner. But the timing remained striking. In the same years Krauss was barely able to sing, her identity still carried enough weight that someone tried to live inside it. That's how powerful her voice had been. Even when it was gone, And maybe that's the point. Losing her voice didn't erase Alison Krauss. It revealed just how much space she occupied, even in silence. Alison Krauss's private love life. Alison Krauss has always moved through her personal life the same way she moves through music, quietly, deliberately, and without inviting the audience too close. That instinct was already firmly in place by 1996 when she met Pat Burgesson. What followed didn't unfold cautiously or with hesitation. It came fast, the kind of fast that feels less like impulse and more like recognition. Within a month, they were married. December 8, 1996. No extended courtship, no public buildup, no sense of spectacle. Just a small, private ceremony and the mutual understanding that life, for both of them, was already moving at full speed. Pat came from the same musical universe. He wasn't impressed by stages or studios because they were already his daily environment. A guitarist and harmonica player, he'd built a career working alongside respected artists, slipping easily between live performances and recording sessions. He understood the hours, the travel, the emotional whiplash of creative work. On paper, it looked right. Two musicians who spoke the same language. Two people who didn't need to explain why silence sometimes mattered just as much as sound. 2 years into the marriage, they welcomed their son, Sam. For a brief moment, everything appeared to settle. Family life layered over an already demanding career, a sense of grounding, a sense that something lasting had been built beneath the motion. But intensity, even when it feels purposeful, has a shelf life. And speed, no matter how confident it looks at the start, eventually demands its reckoning. By 2001, the marriage was over. 5 years from beginning to end. There was no public unraveling, no messy interviews, no dramatic statements designed to control the narrative. Krauss did what she has always done when something cuts too close. She kept it contained. She was granted full custody of their son, and her focus narrowed immediately. Family first, privacy above all else. The end of the marriage didn't become a storyline. It became something she folded inward, carried quietly, and refused to let define her publicly. After that, her romantic life stayed largely out of view. She dated briefly and discreetly, including a short relationship with John Waite, but nothing lingered long enough to take root in the public imagination. And that wasn't accidental. Krauss had learned early how quickly private choices could become public property, and how unforgiving that transition could be. Still, absence has a way of attracting projection. Years later, when her name became linked to Robert Plant, curiosity turned into speculation almost immediately. The contrast alone felt irresistible. Krauss was known for restraint, stillness, and emotional precision. Plant carried decades of rock mythology, volume, and lived-in history. When they came together musically, it felt charged, unexpected, and undeniable. The music landed hard, the acclaim followed quickly, and just as predictably, so did the rumors. Fans wanted to believe the chemistry extended beyond the studio. They wanted a romance that matched the sound, something dramatic enough to explain the electricity they heard. But the truth was far less theatrical. Their connection lived entirely inside the music. Mutual respect, shared curiosity, a deep appreciation for each other's instincts and influences. Outside of that space, their lives didn't intersect the way people imagined. Krauss has always been the more private one. She doesn't blur personal boundaries for public consumption. She doesn't correct every assumption or clarify every rumor. Silence for her has never meant secrecy. It has meant control. Plant, by his own admission, lives louder, shaped by a long and very public past. Their paths ran alongside each other, not together. Different rhythms, different needs. The collaboration worked precisely because those lines stayed intact. Still, the speculation lingered. And it lingered because Krauss didn't rush to shut it down. When she doesn't explain herself, people fill in the gaps. When she steps back, they invent reasons. Silence becomes a canvas. What's rarely acknowledged is how much her personal life had already trained her for that dynamic. The speed of her marriage, the quiet finality of its end, the decision to protect her son from unnecessary noise. Each experience reinforced the same lesson. Not everything needs to be shared to be real, and not every truth needs an audience. So while the public searched for romance to explain her distance, the reality was far more grounded. Alison Krauss had loved deeply and quickly. She had separated cleanly. She had learned early on how costly it could be when private life collided with public expectation, and she adjusted accordingly. That instinct to pull back didn't come from mystery or aloofness. It came from experience, from knowing exactly how much of herself she could afford to give without losing something essential in the process. Over time, that instinct hardened into discipline. Control became protection. Containment became survival. And then, quietly, that same discipline began pressing inward. Years of emotional precision, years of never oversharing, years of holding everything together without letting it spill. The same control that kept her personal life intact began to shape everything else. Presence required vulnerability, singing demanded openness, and openness became harder to reach when every instinct told her to hold back. By the time later challenges surfaced, the pattern was already there. Krauss didn't respond with chaos or confession. She responded the only way she knew how, by stepping inward. At 54, Alison Krauss reveals why she divorced him. And it's bad. Alison Krauss has spent most of her life mastering restraint, and nowhere has that been clearer than in how she handled the end of her first marriage. When she divorced fellow musician Pat Bergeson in 2001, she didn't frame it as a turning point or a heartbreak story. She barely framed it at all. Instead, she folded it into the background of her life and redirected attention to the only places she felt truly safe: her music and her son. The marriage itself had moved quickly, almost recklessly fast. After a courtship that barely stretched beyond a few weeks, they married in December 1997. At the time, it didn't feel impulsive to her. It felt efficient. Two musicians, two people who understood long hours, touring schedules, and emotional pressure. There was comfort in that shared reality, and when their son Sam was born in July 1999, it seemed to confirm that the speed had led somewhere solid. But by 2001, it was over. There was no public explanation, no airing of grievances. Krauss was granted full custody of Sam, and that became the center of her world almost overnight. Whatever had fractured the marriage, she refused to let it fracture her child's sense of stability. From that point on, motherhood wasn't just part of her life, it was the anchor. When she did acknowledge the divorce at all, it was in passing, almost offhand. In a 2002 interview, she joked dryly about her Nashville home still showing the familiar scars left behind by separation, referring to exes as an occupational hazard of the country music world. The comment was light, almost dismissive, but it carried weight. It was the closest she came to admitting that the split had left its mark. Years later, her reflections shifted again, this time toward time and loss rather than blame. In a 2009 interview, she spoke about watching her son grow up, about how there was once a period when his entire world revolved around her. The way she described it wasn't dramatic. It was wistful, a quiet recognition that those early years, shaped in the aftermath of her divorce, passed far too quickly. What Krauss never did was explain why the marriage ended. She never offered details, never expressed bitterness, never reframed herself as a victim or a survivor. That silence wasn't avoidance. It was protection of her son, of herself, and of a truth she clearly didn't believe needed public approval. Now, at 54, that silence reads differently. Not as secrecy, but as control. A choice to let time speak where words never could. Whatever happened inside that marriage was serious enough to end it quickly, cleanly, and permanently. Serious enough that she chose privacy over catharsis, stability over spectacle. And when you look back with that lens, the message becomes clearer. Alison Krauss didn't divorce Pat because of drama. She divorced him because something fundamental didn't work. And once she knew that, she didn't linger. She moved forward and she never looked back. What do you think about Alison Krauss's songs? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.